Hello. This will be the first of two lectures about the labor movement in the United States. I'll be drawing on both past and present examples, and it'll be the first in a series of lectures about the larger question of resistance and social movements, and like resistance to social inequality. So I'm going to go to the screen share here and pull up the PowerPoint. So, yeah, as I said, the question that is going to basically occupy the last few lectures of this course is going to be the question of how social movements have resisted inequality in seeking social change. So that is, we're kind of shifting gears from looking at questions of reproduction, as we've done in the previous four lectures, to now looking at questions of resistance. And we'll be talking about this concept that's very important in sociology, the concept of social movements, which are defined as collective action and protest for equality that create political possibilities for social reform and justice. And so the examples that we'll be looking at here, as I said, have to do with the labor movement. We'll be looking at the current examples of the organizing that's been going on in Amazon warehouses with the Amazon Labor Union, and also the unionization drive at Starbucks with the union known as Starbucks Workers United. And then we'll go to look at historical examples, and this will be the first of two more kind of like historical lectures about the labor movement. This one will be looking at a variety of examples and incidents roughly between the 1870s and the 19-teens. So the railroad strike, what's known as the Great Upheaval of 1877, the Homestead strike, the Pullman strike, the Ludlow massacre, the movement for an 8-hour workday after the Civil War, the Haymarket protest and bombing of 1886, the Atlanta washerwomen's strike of 1881, the garment strike of 1909, and the Lawrence textile, so-called bread and roses strike of 1912. So you can see here that these are not exactly in chronological order. It's a mix of more kind of a thematic organization with some chronological organization. The next set of lectures after this one, or the next lecture after this one, we'll be looking at historical examples that roughly span from the 19-teens to the 1940s. So we've kind of established in previous lectures, especially the first few lectures on where we kind of map the landscape of social inequality and its historical development over time, historically, that there's this relationship between union membership and social equality. And as it says here, as union membership has eroded, has declined, the share of total income in the economy that gets funneled to the rich has skyrocketed. As seen in this graph, there was less income inequality in the decades following World War II than there is today. Not coincidentally, union membership was at its highest rate in 1945, just as the war was ending. But as union strength steadily declined, particularly after 1979, income inequality got worse, and it is now at its worst point since the Great Depression. So this is a theme we've touched on in multiple lectures throughout the semester about how there are these different periods in American history when we look at the landscape of social inequality, where things actually became more equal in the period right around World War II and shortly thereafter. And then since sometime in the late 1970s, 1980s, the forms of social inequality have grown much, much worse. And so there's these two periods. Robert Reich talked about this in the film that you watched. It's been a recurring theme, especially in the early classes of the semester. The difference between this period between like the 1940s and the 1970s, and then the period since the 1970s, the period after the 40s being one of more social equality. And so we see here in this graph how these things are inversely related. As union membership has declined, income inequality has risen. So it makes a lot of sense from a basic, arithmetic standpoint, that as workers have been less likely to be represented by a union, their wages have stagnated or fallen, and conversely, the profits and income and wealth going to the richest has increased. Again, a theme that we've talked about pretty much all semester. So by bringing workers' collective power to the bargaining table, unions are able to better win wages and benefits for working people, reducing income inequality as a result. In 2022, union membership plateaued at 10% of workers, while the top 10%, the top 1% of income earners earned almost 20% of total income. Unions also reduce racial disparities in wages and raise women's wages, helping to counteract disparate labor market outcomes by race and gender that result from occupational segregation, discrimination, and other labor market inequities related to structural racism and sexism. So this last point is especially important when it comes to the intersectional approach that we've been talking again about all semester, how you can't understand the inequalities of social class without understanding how they intersect and are related with the inequalities of race and gender. That to get a full understanding of the landscape of social inequality, we have to take this intersectional approach in which we understand how class, race, and gender are interconnected while not being reducible or certainly not the same. So class, race, and gender as interrelated variables in understanding social inequality. Now, we turn to sort of the question of why then, if unions are so good for workers, why has union membership been declining for decades, since the late 1970s? Why have we seen this steady erosion of union membership? And so here in the next two slides, we talk about political and economic factors behind this declining union membership, the political and economic reasons for this decline, this erosion. And as it says here, the obstacles to forming a union have grown in recent decades. Some 27 states have passed so-called right-to-work laws, which make forming a union more difficult in states with those laws and provide a refuge for companies looking to escape unions in states without those laws. And as you see from the map on the right-hand side, those states that have right to work, that are so-called right-to-work states, are mainly concentrated in the South and the Midwest. That is to say, the more politically conservative states in the Union, where the Republicans have a majority or even a supermajority in the state legislature. And so they're able to pass through these laws that are very detrimental to workers and are very favorable to corporations. And so there's a reason why there has been a kind of a migration of that sort of work towards the South and the Midwest, of corporations looking, as it says here, for a refuge from organized labor. Organized labor is stronger, especially in the Northeast, in the northeastern cities. And so the South and the Midwest have become this kind of this refuge, this haven to maintain a low-wage labor force. There are other political forces at work, political and economic forces here at work. Globalization has given companies the option to close up shop and move overseas. Again, as we've seen, especially in the lecture on political economy, I talked about this phenomenon of globalization. Automation has given companies the option to replace their workers with machines. This is something that is as old as capitalism itself. The use of automation and now, like today, artificial intelligence, but all kinds of forms of machinery and technology that have been used to replace human labor. Another factor has been deregulation, which we have talked about, especially again in the lecture on political economy. Deregulation has increased industry competition and weakened unions' ability to extract concessions from monopolistic companies. And finally, corporations now spend millions and millions on highly paid consultants, developing effective tactics to suppress unionizing efforts and pressure their workers into submission. This will be especially important, as we'll see in the next couple of slides, when we talk about Starbucks and Amazon. They have both spent millions of dollars in trying to fight the unionization efforts at their shops. Meanwhile, the economy continues to shift away from sectors that were traditionally union strongholds. So here we get into more kind of like the economic factors. The most unionized sectors in America, manufacturing, transportation, and construction, represent an ever-shrinking share of the workforce. Unionization in the service sector is harder than in historic union strongholds like manufacturing. So on the one hand, turnover is much higher in the modern service sector than in the workplaces of the past, which may weaken worker solidarity and reduce the incentive to fight for a better working environment at a particular establishment. In other words, because workers don't expect to work there long term. And secondly, workplaces in the service sector tend to be much smaller, which increases the logistical difficulty and transaction costs for unions to organize workplaces, because they have to be organized painstakingly one by one, as seen, as recently illustrated by the unionizing at Starbucks. So here we're talking about the kind of the long-term shift from a manufacturing-based economy to a service-based economy. And so we discussed this in the lecture on political economy, that this was something that has been, decades and decades in the making, but that really accelerated after the 1970s. And so these two different kinds of economy are put different kinds of constraints on the ability to organize a union, to organize, for people to organize their fellow workers. The service sector tends to be, as it says here, a higher rate of turnover, and tends to have smaller shops in terms of smaller numbers of employees. Unlike, say, General Motors, where the people had factories with hundreds or thousands of people working in them. You're talking about a smaller workforce and a more transient workforce. I think that's really kind of the even more important factor here is that there's just such a high rate of turnover. And so this has been a problem for organizing efforts, say at Walmart, or today in like the gig economy, And it's kind of a, miraculous, well, maybe not miraculous, but it's certainly impressive that like Starbucks workers have been able to, kind of, in many cases, overcome that obstacle. And so these are the kinds of, the greater challenges that have been posed as the economy has gone this kind of long-term systemic shift from a more manufacturing-based to a more service-based economy. So the examples that we're going to look at here have to do with the Amazon and Starbucks. So the Amazon Labor Union is an independent labor union for Amazon workers founded in 2021 by a labor activist group led by Chris Smalls, who is pictured here speaking at a rally with Bernie Sanders right behind him. And, obviously this was one of many rallies that took place in the lead up effort to organizing this factory in Staten Island, New York. On April 1st, 2022, the workers at a warehouse in Staten Island became the first Amazon union recognized by the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, which is the sort of governing arbitrator of labor relations at the federal level. Amazon spent $4.3 million on its union busting consultants. Their anti-union messaging papered the warehouse's bathroom stalls and hallways, and were also sent to workers via mailings, Instagram ads, phone calls, text messages, and videos projected on screens inside the facility. So there's this massive, basically like propaganda campaign by Amazon that had, workers as its captive audience, not only when they're like at work and inside the facility, but even like on their phones, and their, text messages and Instagram. And yet, despite those efforts and despite this huge amount of money, the Amazon workers won. It was a close vote, but they did secure a majority of the workers that voted to be represented by this union. The ALU's success has been called one of the biggest victories for organized labor in a generation, and the most important labor victory in the United States since the 1930s. So this was really seen as historical in a lot of ways, and perhaps a sign of things to come in the context of other unionizing efforts that have been going on, in the last 5 years or so. Starbucks workers are also something that we can, suggest that this may be also a sign of resurgence in organized labor. As of June 2023, over 8,000 workers at over 360 Starbucks stores in at least 40 states in the United States have voted to unionize. This unionization effort started at a store in Buffalo, New York. And then internationally, Starbucks workers have also unionized in Chile, New Zealand, and Canada. So this is, again, something that really has taken the world by storm. And again, I think it's fairly miraculous in light of the high rate of turnover and the small workforce that, Starbucks is kind of emblematic of the service sector in that regard. Starting in November 2021, Starbucks began an aggressive union busting campaign that included mandatory listening sessions and personal visits from founder Howard Schultz. Howard Schultz has taken a real personal interest in combating this unionization drive. Starbucks Workers United claim that more than 200 workers have been illegally fired since the unionization drive began in 2021. In October 2023, a National Labor Relations Board judge ruled that Starbucks violated federal law in Kansas and Missouri when it fired pro-union employees and asked police to disperse workers with picket signs. So one of the aspects of the NLRB law is that it is illegal to fire people just for unionizing, for being part of a union or trying to lead an organizing effort. Now, in practice, they do it all the time, as we see here with Starbucks. But they have to at least find some other pretense for firing people. And yet there are all of these cases that are still in front of the courts, in front of the NLRB courts, about this being a practice that Starbucks has engaged in to basically intimidate people out of unionizing. So we're going to now, in this part of the lecture, turn towards some history. And this is a history that I think is very important for people to know, because a lot of it has been kind of erased, and it certainly isn't taught, in most schools to most students. And yet the fact of the matter is that United States history is sort of replete with these sorts of examples of workers organizing and struggling and fighting for a better life for themselves. And so I think it's important to understand that these, how these current struggles that I just talked about are kind of continuous with this longer history of struggle. So we're going to go back to what's called the Gilded Age here. The rise of the labor movement during the Gilded Age, which is roughly between the 1870s and the 1890s, especially against the railroad companies and the so-called robber barons. So at that time, the railroad companies were the biggest employer, the biggest private employer in the country. And the robber barons were basically the people that owned these, sort of like the capitalist class of the time that owned those railroads and were widely disliked by people at the time, and kind of became the object of class hatred and class struggle during this this part of the late 19th century. So these are in green here. These are basically the themes that we're going to be drawing on as far as kind of like lessons or patterns that we see in the history of labor movements and class struggle. So another key theme that we'll be looking at is violence, and when we look at American labor history, it's kind of surprising. It's kind of almost kind of shocking how violent it was, both, as it says here, in terms of like the repression by the police first and foremost, but also in private militias and private security that were hired by the companies. There's a whole detective agency that's created at that time called the Pinkertons. They're still around, actually. They're still engaging in union busting kind of activities. Like, they're basically union busters for hire, like these private like goon squads that would beat people up, and many people were killed by them, and also in the courts. So there's kind of a combination of private and public forces that have been used in various strikes and labor upheavals in American history. And the other part of it, though, is that workers have fought back. I mean, they didn't like take this lying down. And not only, workers on strike, but also like entire like working class communities, would come out and participated in this kind of, this very epic class struggle that really was raging at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, as we're going to talk about here. Also, a big part of this, another major theme that we're going to talk on is the struggle for shorter working hours. This really begins after the Civil War, in the struggle for a shorter working day, and then culminates in what we now know as the 8-hour workday. So previously, like the 12 hours would have been more like the standard. And so the whole reason that the 8-hour workday is thought of as a norm, as a standard, is because of these labor struggles. It wasn't handed down by God or the Ten Commandments, and it certainly wasn't something that was given up by capital, by the employing class. It was something that was fought for by the working class. And actually, as the working class has gotten weaker, the capitalist class has been chipping away at that 8-hour workday. Same with like the weekend, the whole concept of the weekend, like there's a bumper sticker. I don't see it around much anymore, but I used to see it more often, that said, the labor movement, are the folks that brought you the weekend. Like if you enjoy the weekend, thank these previous generations, these ancestors of ours who engaged in these epic struggles, and also realize that like as organized labor has gotten weaker, the capitalist class has been chipping away at the weekend too. So the fourth kind of theme that we'll be looking at is the rise of the group known as the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, after 1905, and the role that they have played, especially in organizing immigrant and so-called unskilled labor. They have played an important role in organizing workers that would not be organized by more like craft-oriented unions that were just kind of like trying to protect their own members. So the IWW was really, and they're still around also. The IWW has really been the most kind of radical movement in terms of organizing, immigrants and unskilled labor, and also the most radical in terms of like the tactics that they have taken, things like sabotage and, other forms of like direct action that the more conservative unions would not engage in. And then finally, at the last part of the lecture, we're going to be looking at the leading role of Black women and immigrant women in strikes, especially by domestic workers and textile workers. And so that'll encompass like the Atlanta washerwomen's strike and the Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and the uprising of the 20,000 garment workers in New York City. On the right side are basically just like my sort of the sources that I drew from for this part of the lecture. And by no means is this a comprehensive list. I'm sure I left out a ton of good books. I'm not a labor historian. That's not my specialty. So these are just like a short list, but also of books that I not only like draw from, but books that I think that are all good reading, like that I recommend if you're interested in this history. Okay, so looking at the Gilded Age, the railroads, and the robber barons. The period of US history roughly between the 1870s and the 1890s is often called the Gilded Age due to its extreme inequalities of wealth. The Gilded Age was actually a phrase invented by Mark Twain. I wrote a book about this, and the Gilded Age was kind of like satirizing, kind of poking fun at these rich people that have everything made out of gold, kind of like Donald Trump does today. During these years, railroad companies made huge profits and acquired enormous power, and their owners were called robber barons due to their ruthless and unscrupulous business practices. The railroad companies and the robber barons were widely reviled throughout US society. People, hated them the way that, a lot of people today hate, Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, or, they become like kind of the objects of, like the personalized objects of people's class rage. A financial panic occurred in 1873 as a result of financial speculation in railroad construction. What was then known as the Long Depression began and lasted more than 5 years, the longest economic contraction in American history to that point. Unemployment rose dramatically, reaching 14% by 1876, and wages overall dropped to 45% of their previous level. Thousands of American businesses failed, defaulting on more than $1 billion of debt. So this is one of the first, maybe not the first, but one of the first busts in the sort of cycle that we see throughout the history of capitalism of booms and busts. And at the root of it, just like the crisis in 2008, the root of this panic is finance and financial speculation, right? These banks speculating in railroad construction and real estate, and at a certain point, kind of like the bubble bursts, but the people that bear the weight of that crisis, the people that suffer from that crisis, are not the people who caused it. The people who suffer that crisis are working people, and just like in 2000, during like Occupy Wall Street, people would chant, like the banks got sold, the banks got bailed out, we got sold out, and it's just the same. It's just the same thing that happened in the 1880s. It's, in the 1870s and 1880s, when this kind of bubble bursts, and then just like shit rolls downhill. It's just like it's the people that pay the price for it are not the people who caused it. So you have like high unemployment, and wages are dropping, and people are starving, and people are suffering, and businesses are failing, and people are in debt. And, this is all a very kind of familiar story to anybody who's been alive in looking at the history of capitalism. So the Great Railroad Strike begins among workers in 1877, in the summer of 1877, after the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad cut wages for the third time in a year. And the workers basically started fighting back in this period of high unemployment and low wages, and working people being made to bear the brunt of a crisis caused by finance. At its height, the strikes involved about 100,000 workers. In several cities, workers burned down and destroyed physical facilities, engines, passenger cars and freight cars. They were not fucking around. They started basically destroying stuff. Um, and so this strike basically, it starts like I think in Martinsburg, West Virginia, if I remember correctly, and then quickly spreads to cities, along the railroads. And as I mentioned earlier, like the railroads were like the biggest employer of American workers at the time. And so these sort of strikes start to, or I mean, just like this, basically this big rebellion. I don't even know that the word strike is really the appropriate thing. Is just this like more of this kind of spontaneous popular uprising. And then basically the federal troops and the National Guard and these private militias are all marshaled in to fight back. And there's this huge wave of violence through the summer of 1877. As it says, like 100 people are killed in these various melees. One of them shown here of just like the militia or the police. It's kind of hard to distinguish like who was the police and who was the private, like Pinkertons or the private security guards. Basically just like firing into the crowd, but then like people throwing bricks and stuff back at them. So it's not like a fair fight, but it was like people didn't take this lying down. And so in these railroad communities, it wasn't just the workers that were fighting back. It was often like the whole everybody in the community would come out, men and women, and fighting against the police and these private militias that have been basically deployed against the workers. So this is this is why they call it the Great Upheaval. It's just this huge sort of like coming out, by entire communities against what the powers that the railroad companies had, and then the way that they were able to use like the police and state forces on their side. This we see this same kind of pattern in the Homestead strike in Pennsylvania. The Homestead strike was a violent labor dispute between the Carnegie Steel Company that was owned by Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick, and steel workers that occurred on July 6, 1892 in Homestead, Pennsylvania, right across from Pittsburgh. Frick was a notorious union buster, union hater, and he deliberately provoked a strike by slashing wages at his steel mills in Pittsburgh. When the strike began, the company's management then hired strikebreakers, replacement workers, more commonly known as scabs. And they also hired the Pinkertons, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, to protect those strikebreakers, those scabs. Frick hired 300 Pinkerton detectives and brought them by boat to the Homestead factories. A gun battle ensued in which a number of Pinkerton agents were killed, and Pinkerton agents and strikers were both killed on both sides, and many more injured. By the end of the battle, 40 workers had been shot and 9 killed. 20 Pinkertons were shot, 7 died, and scores more were injured. So this turned into a gunfight on both sides. And again, like people in these communities were not gonna just like kind of passively take this. Another major eruption of violence we see a couple of years later, this time in Chicago, the Pullman strike, May to July 1894. Again, a railroad strike, a strike among railroad workers, and a boycott that disrupted rail traffic in the Midwest. Workers at the Pullman Place Company in Chicago went on strike, responding to layoffs, wage cuts, and firings. And then eventually some 125 to 250,000 railroad workers in 27 states joined them in solidarity. So just as with the Great Upheaval in 1877, this is a thing that starts in one location, but then spreads to railroad workers in other communities. And so it kind of spreads like a wildfire through the Midwest. The US Attorney General obtained an injunction that President Grover Cleveland used to dispatch federal troops to address the strike. In Chicago, 13 people were killed, 53 seriously wounded, 700 people were arrested. Before the strike was over, perhaps 34 were dead. With 14,000 police, militia, troops in Chicago, the strike was crushed. So they crushed the strike, but basically kind of war like mobilization. This is like the historian Howard Zinn referred to it as America's other civil war, right? So it's this mobilization of the police and the state and these private militias in massive numbers in a warlike mobilization. One of the strike's leaders, by the name of Eugene Debs, would soon become a prominent figure in the development of US socialism. He ran for president as the nominee of the Socialist Party, I believe 4 times, including one time from when he was in jail. So Eugene Debs is really, one of the most prominent figures in the history of American socialism. I encourage you to read up about him on your own. After the strike, President Cleveland basically created Labor Day, what we today still celebrate in September, as a kind of a co-optation of the workers' holiday, which is May 1st, International Workers' Day. When we talk about the Haymarket bombing and incident here in a minute, we'll see that May 1st, figures prominently. And so the US government, kind of created this Labor Day as this kind of concessionary holiday. It's this classic move of co-optation to, try to take away, to give the workers a little bit of something, but in a way that took away their holiday and recognizes this other one that we celebrate to this day. The Ludlow massacre. This happens among mining workers in Colorado, 1914. Some 10,000 miners with the United Mine Workers of America had been on strike since September of 1913, protesting low pay and abysmal working conditions in the coal fields of Colorado. Evicted from the company towns by the operators of industrialist John D. Rockefeller's Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, striking miners constructed tent colonies, the largest of which housed 1,200 workers in Ludlow. On April 20th, 1914, the private army hired by Rockefeller opened fire on striking mining families in their tent colony. The miners fired back, but eventually ran out of ammunition. The guards then went on a rampage, drenching the tents with oil and setting them on fire, beating and shooting the miners while destroying their personal belongings. 13 women and children were burned to death, and 3 strikers were executed on the spot. Because remember, we're talking about whole families of people that have moved out to Colorado in search of, this kind of work. So all these examples are meant to kind of illustrate, as I said earlier, when talking about the major themes of US labor history, this violence that's enacted by a combination of private and public forces. And so this, obviously doesn't cover everything or, all the major incidents of this time period, but it's just more to kind of illustrate that larger thematic point about the history of these class struggles in American society. Another, key theme that we're looking at and a basis for struggle and labor organizing has been the movement for shorter working hours, as I mentioned a couple of slides ago. After the Civil War ended in 1865, there was this movement for shorter hours that eventually would culminate in the 8-hour workday that we know today. Many cities, including San Francisco, where workers were, very active, and as we'll see in the next lecture as well, San Francisco has really been historically, at least, a stronghold of the labor movement. And so there was basically these marches around the country, and this mobilization that begins, and around the slogan of 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we will. So basically a movement for less work and more leisure. And so the first labor federation in the United States, like the first kind of organized, national group, forms in 1866, called the National Labor Union, and its main demand was for an 8-hour workday. Now, this 8-hour workday would be one with a very violent cost, and the key moment, which is referred to as the Haymarket incident, or the Haymarket bombing, begins here in May of 1886, on May Day, 1st of May, 1886, in the city of Chicago. On that day, Albert Parsons, head of the Chicago Knights of Labor, led 80,000 people down Michigan Avenue in Chicago in what is regarded as the first modern May Day parade, with the cry, 8-hour day with no cut in pay. In the next few days, they were joined nationwide by 350,000 workers who went on strike at 1,200 factories, including 70,000 in Chicago, 45,000 in New York, 32,000 in Cincinnati, and thousands in other cities. So in Northeast and Midwest, this movement begins to spread among working people. And so this is something that's sort of escalating quickly. On May 3rd, 1886, just like 2 days later, August Spies, the editor of a local workers' newspaper, spoke at a meeting of 6,000 workers, and afterwards, many of them moved down the street to harass strikebreakers who've been brought in at the McCormick plant in Chicago. The police arrived and opened fire, and the police then killed 4 people and wounded many more people in the crowd. And so one of the things that we see in these various incidents is that police violence, police, shooting into crowds of strikers and things like that, tends to escalate the mobilization. And instead of, cowering and scaring people, it kind of motivates them to fight back. And so at a subsequent rally the next day to protest this violence, a bomb explodes at the Haymarket Square in Chicago. and seven police officers and 4 civilians are killed in the blast. Hundreds of labor activists are then rounded up and prominent labor leaders arrested, tried, and convicted. So basically there's this bombing, 7 police officers are killed, and then there's this hunt for, to basically, to get all these labor leaders and activists and round them up into a charge of conspiracy to engage in this action. 7 of those were sentenced to death, and 1 to a term of 15 years in prison. The governor commuted 2 of those sentences to terms of life in prison, and another committed suicide and jailed before his scheduled execution. And so then the other 4, sometimes called the Haymarket Martyrs, were hanged on November 11th, 1887. So now we want to take up the theme I mentioned earlier, the role that women, especially, have played in the labor movement, and particularly Black women and immigrant women. Sometimes labor history is thought of as something that, is just like these white men or these, European immigrant men who, are working in like manufacturing or, other kinds of like, physical blue collar, kinds of occupations. And yet when we look at the history of the labor movement, it's clear that like women, and again, like especially Black women and immigrant women, have played a really central role in organizing and in class struggles. So we're just going to look at a few examples of that, a few of the more like well-known examples. But there's there are many others that I'm not able to cover in the scope of this lecture. One of these is the Atlanta washerwomen's strike that takes place in 1881. For context, you have to understand that less than 20 years after the end of the Civil War, half of Atlanta's Black wage earners were women, and almost all of them were doing domestic work for white households. Of those, many women were employed as laundresses or washerwomen, to whom wealthy, middle class, and even poor whites would send their dirty clothes. Washerwomen, including many former slaves, made between $4 and $8 a month for long hours of physically demanding labor. In the summer of 1881, 20 washerwomen met and formed the Washing Society, comprised entirely of African American women. Canvassing fellow workers and garnering support from the city's Black churches, the society's ranks swelled from 20 to 3,000 laundresses in just 3 weeks. So again, these are kind of movements that accelerate and spread, like wildfire. They kind of go, they expand exponentially as opposed to arithmetically. Their numbers increase as a sort of a wave, kind of takes over people. And this is what we see in the history of a lot of social movements, how they, seem to intensify and grow stronger very, very quickly. So the strike here that we're talking about was one that was of several that have been organized by domestic workers in the southern U.S. during this time. Previously, the Galveston in Galveston, Texas, in 1877, and in Jackson, Mississippi, in 1866. Though neither of these was larger than the Atlanta strike. So there's basically this this wave of movement that had been building, up to this point. Strike meetings were held every night, and strikers faced arrest and harassment from the police. But on July 19th, the Washing Society declared a strike demanding higher wages. Shortly after the washerwomen's strike, Atlanta's government caved to demands from cooks, maids, hotel workers, and nurses for higher pay. So this, is a good example of how when people have power in numbers, when they're able to organize and maintain solidarity with one another, they can win demands, they can win concessions. And we have the lessons of history here to show us that this is true. Next, we look at the garment workers' strike of 1909. This is a strike in New York that was particularly involved a lot of immigrant women, like young immigrant women. In 1909, Yiddish-speaking women, many of them in their teens and early 20s, orchestrated an 11-week strike, general strike, across hundreds of shops in New York City's shirtwaist industry known as the needle trades. So the places that were making clothes, and these were women who were essentially like sweatshop workers. And just like sweatshop workers today, they're mostly young women, and making the lowest of low wages and subjected to like the worst working conditions. This uprising of the 20,000 was the largest strike by female American workers up to that date. It all started with a spat of spontaneous strikes protesting workplace safety issues, low wages, and rampant sexual harassment, among other issues. In conditions common throughout the industry, workers worked uninterrupted 14-hour shifts with just one bathroom break. So all these ways in which like workers are, being squeezed at in every hour of the day, and being, watched and surveilled and controlled throughout the whole process, throughout the whole work process. And so this uprising of the 20,000 basically is all these women in New York who are working at, all these different little shops, and they organize together on a citywide basis, like not just like one, shop, but like across the whole city, so connecting hundreds of shops, and most of them concentrated on like the Lower East Side and these places, the more like working class immigrant parts of New York City. And so this uprising of the 1909, the uprising of the 20,000, it brings together, Italian and Eastern European Jewish women, and many of them don't speak English, and so they're but they're still able to find ways to communicate and maintain a sense of solidarity. That they understand that their working conditions are all kind of bound up with one another, and that they have power in numbers. So the 1909 garment workers strike on November 22nd, 1909, at a meeting organized by the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, voted for a general strike on that day, November 22nd. The next day, 15,000 shirtwaist workers walked out of the factories, and the numbers then swelled to 20 to 30,000 strikers. Most of the strikers were young women between the ages of 16 and 25 years old. Overall, 70% of the strikers were women, and 90% were Jewish. This is a time of massive immigration to New York, especially among Jews from Eastern Europe. And so they were often in, pretty desperate economic conditions, forced to take, the worst of the worst jobs, and, began to sort of organize and fight back against their exploitation. More than 700 were arrested within just 1 month, 19 of whom were sentenced to the workhouse. Several faced beatings by the police. Eventually, strikers' resources were exhausted and the uprising was called off, though not before winning significant concessions. So again, as we see with the Atlanta washerwomen's strike, this organizing among like the most powerless segments of society still ends up being able to enact significant concessions from their employer, and from the system at large. Unfortunately, they're not able to win everything that they wanted, including this call for safer working conditions. Those would not be heeded. And so as a result, there's a tragic event that happens at the same place, at the same workshop where the strike had begun, the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. The Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of New York City broke out on Saturday, March 25th, 1911. It was the deadliest industrial disaster in the history of the city and one of the deadliest in US history. The fire caused the deaths of 146 garment workers. Of those, 123 women and girls and 23 men who died from fire, smoke inhalation, or by falling or jumping to their deaths. Most of the victims were recent Italian or Jewish immigrant workers and girls aged 14 to 23. So it kind of, as you can see from the picture, they are working at the top floor of this building in New York. A fire breaks out in the factory, and the owners have locked the doors, and so they're not able to get out. And so you have this horrible spectacle on the streets of New York where you have all of these young women, many of them on fire, jumping out of this building and landing on the sidewalk. So it's not only a horrible tragedy, it's also a very public one. It's a one that is a spectacle that people in across New York City are witness to, and it becomes a sort of a basis for class anger and class rage, because it's revealed that the owners of this building, of the owners of the shirtwaist company, have locked the doors to keep the workers inside. Because the doors to the stairwells and the exits were locked, which was a common practice at the time to prevent workers from taking unauthorized breaks and to reduce theft. So, like to keep people from stepping out for a smoke or something like that, Many of the workers could not escape from the burning building and jumped from these high windows. The disaster caused widespread outrage in New York City and led to calls for workplace reform and safety standards. The factory owners were indicted on manslaughter charges, but they were acquitted, and that they were later found liable for a wrongful death in a civil suit, but they were acquitted on these larger charges of manslaughter. So, but one of the effects of this is to further galvanize people, working class people and people throughout New York City, to call for reform. That you just can't allow these capitalists, to just decide what kind of safety practices and what kind of workplace conditions best suit their needs and their profit margins. that there has to be some kind of regulation. And so the shirtwaist fire is very galvanizing in what becomes known as the progressive movement, the movement for these kinds of reforms and regulations that are intended to protect workers from the worst, practices of capitalism. Around this time, to talk about the next strike, I need to kind of introduce this group. We briefly mentioned them in the lecture on the farm workers because they had a historical role in organizing farm worker strikes in the Central Valley in California, like during the 19 teens and 20s. They're called the industrial workers of the world. The industrial workers of the world are commonly known as the Wobblies. They're a labor union founded in Chicago in 1905. They're still in existence today. And the IWW, as I said a few slides ago earlier in the lecture, was really at the radical vanguard of the labor movement in the early part of the 20th century. They opposed, as it says here, the mainstream labor unions, which accepted capitalism and refused to include unskilled workers in their craft unions. So the mainstream labor unions, like the American Federation of Labor, were more like about protecting their workers and trying to get their workers a higher wage, but they didn't contest or challenge capitalism as an economic system. They very much accepted it, but just kind of wanted to get their workers a bigger slice of the pie or a better seat at the table, whatever metaphor you want to use. But they had much more, kind of self-interested approach. And a lot of times that meant excluding immigrants and excluding unskilled workers to protect, more skilled workers or more, native-born American workers. So the IWW came in and kind of like filled a void. They did the organizing work where the other unions weren't doing. They organized, more among like the lowest of the low, the unskilled and immigrant workers, and so they had an important role, as it says here, in organizing farm workers, miners, textile workers, all of these that had, a high proportion of immigrants among them. And so they had, an approach that is, summarized in this poster here of one big union. They wanted to kind of like organize everybody. And that was kind of their vision. And they had a real understanding of like class struggle and class inequality that the other unions, didn't really have. This larger perspective about capitalism. So as we quote the preamble to the IWW Constitution, this written in 1905, it says the working class and the employing class have nothing in common. There can be no peace so long as hunger and want are found among millions of the working people, and the few who make up the employing class have all the good things of life. So, long before like Occupy Wall Street, they saw a world that was divided between the 1% and the 99%, and concluded that they had nothing in common, and included that there can be no peace when there is such injustice. So the IWW plays a leading role in this last incident I want to talk about, called the commonly known as the Bread and Roses strike. It's a strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, again organized with a predominantly immigrant, almost entirely immigrant workforce. and people that were making, again, like clothing and textiles. And it was provoked by a pay cut, again, another common thing we've seen in many of these incidents. The strike then spread rapidly through the town, growing to more than 20,000 workers and involving nearly every mill in Lawrence. The strike united workers from more than 51 different nationalities, many of whom knew little to no English. A large number of striking workers, including many leaders of the strike, were Italian immigrants. So you have these, people that don't speak each other's language, they don't share each other's customs, they don't share each other's culture, and yet they're able to recognize their common interests as workers and to organize in spite of those language barriers and cultural obstacles. And so they're able to create this strike that envelops this whole industrial textile town, Lawrence, Massachusetts. Again, like we saw with the uprising of the 20,000, it grows to workers at all these various mills, not just one. And so the IWW is, at the leading, has a leading role in organizing all of this. The IWW raises funds on a nationwide basis to provide weekly benefits for strikers and dramatize the strikers' needs by arranging for several hundred children to go to supporters' homes in New York City. So they're going to basically help these kids of striking workers to go, to New York because, to avoid the danger and the violence. And the city authorities didn't like that. They tried to prevent these kids from going on the train to New York. So when the city's authorities tried to prevent another 100 of these children from going to Philadelphia, the police began clubbing both the children and their mothers and dragged them off to be taken away by truck. And one pregnant woman actually miscarried in all of these events. That police action against the mothers and the children of Lawrence attracted the attention of the nation. It was an outrageous event. And again, as I've mentioned, and as we'll continue to see, acts of police violence and police repression have the effect of throwing gasoline on a fire and basically of causing people to further mobilize. And we see that to this day. So soon, both the House and the Senate set out to investigate the strike. So this action, police brutality, draws the attention of the whole nation. Now everybody's looking at what's going on in Lawrence. The national attention had an effect as the industry agreed to most of the strikers' demands on March 12th, 1912. Their rallying cry, which is again still a rallying cry among workers today, of bread and roses, became a kind of, the embodiment of, as it says here, workers' desires for the good things in life and not just the necessities, right? That we want bread, but we want roses too, and so for people that has meant, a better standard of living. It's been shorter working hours. It's meant a safer workplace. It's meant, having a greater say in your workplace, a more democratic workplace. These are all things that workers have been fighting for, as we see in this historical lesson. All right, so for the next lecture, I'll basically go on to talk about some historical examples from the 19-teens to the 1940s. And then I'll also, as I did with this lecture, talk about some labor actions and movements and things that we see going on today. So we'll be kind of putting the past and the present in dialogue with one another again. Okay, thanks. And see you next time. Bye.